The silence that followed my joke hung in the dining room like smoke from a snuffed candle. I'd meant it as light-hearted dinner conversation, the kind of playful banter that families share over evening meals. Instead, my father's face had turned the color of raw beef, and the silver spoon he'd been holding clattered against my grandmother's china plate before he hurled it across the table at me. "I'm sick of you living off my money." His voice cracked with a fury I hadn't heard since my teenage years, when I'd come home past curfew or forgotten to clean my room. The spoon missed me by inches, leaving a small dent in the wall behind my chair where it struck before falling to the hardwood floor with a metallic ping. My mother, Cordelia Thorne, set down her wine glass with deliberate precision and nodded in agreement, her perfectly styled auburn hair catching the light from the crystal chandelier above our heads. "Your father's absolutely right, Valentina. You're 32 years old, and you're still a disgrace to this family. When are you going to stop being such a disappointment and start taking responsibility for your life?" I stared at them both, my parents who had raised me in this very house, in this very dining room, where we'd shared thousands of meals over the decades. The irony of the situation would have been comical if it weren't so devastating. Here they were, lecturing me about financial responsibility and family disgrace, completely oblivious to the fact that they were sitting in my house, eating food I'd purchased, drinking wine from my cellar, all while living rent-free under my roof. For the past 8 months, the joke I'd made had been simple enough. Earlier that afternoon, I'd received a phone call from my supervisor at Meridian Financial Group, where I'd been working as a senior investment analyst for the past 4 years. Instead of the termination I'd been expecting after some recent restructuring rumors, Patricia Velasquez had offered me a promotion to Vice President of Portfolio Management, complete with a 40% salary increase and my own corner office on the 23rd floor of downtown Seattle's most prestigious financial district. When I'd walked through the front door of my colonial-style home in Bellingham Heights at 6:30 that evening, I'd been practically glowing with excitement. My parents had been waiting in the living room, as had become their routine since they'd moved in with me last winter. My father, Harrington Thorne, had been reading the Wall Street Journal in what used to be my favorite armchair, while my mother had been scrolling through her tablet, probably shopping for things she couldn't afford with her dwindling savings account. "How was work today, sweetheart?" my mother had asked without looking up from her screen, the same perfunctory question she'd been asking me every evening since they'd arrived. That's when I'd decided to have a little fun with them. "Actually, I got fired today," I'd said with a perfectly straight face, watching their reactions carefully. My father had lowered his newspaper slightly, his steel gray eyebrows knitting together in what might have been concern or annoyance. My mother had finally looked up from her tablet, her green eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine shock. "Oh no, Valentina," she'd gasped, one manicured hand flying to her throat. "What happened? What are we going to do?" I'd maintained the charade for exactly 30 seconds before breaking into a grin and revealing the truth. "Just kidding. I actually got promoted to vice president, 40% raise, corner office, the whole package." That announcement had been met with what I'd expected would be congratulations, maybe even a bottle of champagne to celebrate. Instead, my parents had exchanged a look I couldn't quite decipher, and my father had muttered something about not funny, before returning to his newspaper. My mother had simply nodded and gone back to her tablet without so much as a smile. Now, 3 hours later, as we sat around the mahogany dining table that had belonged to my late grandmother Evangeline, my innocent dinner joke had somehow triggered this explosive confrontation about my supposed financial irresponsibility and general failure as a human being. "You know what?" I said, setting down my fork and looking directly at my father. "You're absolutely right. I am living off someone's money, but it's not yours." My father's face, which had been slowly returning to its normal color, flushed red again. "Don't get smart with me, young lady. We've been supporting you your entire life, and this is the thanks we get? Lies and disrespect?" I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest, the same feeling I'd experienced years ago when I'd realized that my childhood dog hadn't simply gone to live on a farm, as my parents had told me. It was the recognition of a fundamental disconnection between the reality I was living and the reality my parents had constructed in their minds. "Supporting me?" I repeated slowly, tasting each word as if it were unfamiliar. "Dad, when exactly have you supported me? Because I'm trying to remember, and I'm coming up blank." My mother leaned forward in her chair, her pearl necklace catching the light. "Valentina Rose Thorne, don't you dare speak to your father that way. We raised you, fed you, clothed you, put a roof over your head for 18 years. And then what?" I asked, genuinely curious about their version of events. "What happened after I turned 18? My father's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. "We sent you to college, 4 years at Northwestern, which cost us a fortune." I nodded slowly, remembering those 4 years very differently than he apparently did. "You mean the college education I paid for entirely with academic scholarships, student loans, and part-time jobs? The one where you told me I was on my own financially because you needed to save money for your early retirement?" "You got scholarships because we raised you to be smart," my mother interjected, her voice taking on the defensive tone she'd perfected over the years. "That's support." "And after college?" I pressed on, feeling like an archaeologist carefully brushing away layers of accumulated revisionist history. "What support did you provide then?" The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. My parents exchanged another look, this one tinged with something that might have been uncertainty. "We were there for you emotionally," my father said finally. Though his voice lacked its earlier conviction, I almost laughed, but the sound that came out was more like a cough. "Emotionally? You mean like when I got my first job at Meridian and called to tell you the good news and you said I was probably just a diversity hire? Or when I bought this house at 28 and you told everyone at the country club that I must have gotten some kind of special loan program for poor people?" My mother's face had gone pale, and she was fidgeting with her wedding ring, a nervous habit I'd noticed since childhood. "That's not... we didn't mean it like that." "Or maybe you meant the emotional support you showed when I was going through my divorce with Marcus," I continued, feeling years of suppressed frustration bubbling to the surface. "When you told me I should have tried harder to make my marriage work, even after I explained that he'd been cheating on me with his dental hygienist for 2 years. "Now you're just being dramatic," my father said, but his voice had lost its earlier fire. "Marriage is hard work. We were trying to help you see that." I looked around the dining room that had been my sanctuary for the past 4 years, since I'd purchased this house with my own money, my own credit, my own hard-earned down payment. The Persian rug beneath the table was one I'd selected myself. The artwork on the walls represented my taste, my aesthetic choices. Even the china we were eating from had been purchased by me, piece by piece, as I'd slowly built the kind of elegant home I'd dreamed of since childhood. "Let me ask you something," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside my chest. "Do you know who owns this house?" My parents looked at each other, then back at me. My father cleared his throat. "Well, I assume it's in both our names, given that we're family and we've been living here together." The assumption was so breathtakingly wrong that for a moment I couldn't speak. "Both our names?" I repeated. "Dad, you've never made a single mortgage payment on this house. You've never paid a utility bill, never contributed to property taxes, never even offered to help with maintenance costs." "We're your parents," my mother said, as if that explained everything. "Family doesn't charge family rent. Family also doesn't usually move in uninvited and stay for 8 months without contributing anything to household expenses," I replied, thinking back to that cold February morning when they'd shown up at my front door with 6 suitcases and a story about needing a place to stay just temporarily while they figured out their retirement finances. I'd been happy to help, of course. Despite our complicated relationship, they were my parents, and I'd been raised to believe that family took care of family. I had offered them the guest suite upstairs, thinking they'd stay for a few weeks, maybe a month at most, while they sorted out whatever financial crisis had prompted their sudden displacement from their longtime home in the suburbs. 8 months later, they'd made no moves to find alternative housing. They'd settled into my home as if it were their own, rearranging furniture, changing the television channels to their preferred programs, even going so far as to replace my environmentally friendly cleaning products with their preferred chemical-heavy brands. My father had taken over my home office for his investment research, which seemed to consist mainly of reading financial magazines and complaining about the stock market. My mother had claimed the guest bathroom as her personal spa, filling it with expensive skincare products that I was fairly certain she was charging to credit cards that were already maxed out. "We didn't move in uninvited," my father said, his defensive tone confirming what I'd long suspected about their version of that February morning. "You offered to let us stay here." "I offered to let you stay temporarily," I corrected, as in, for a short period of time while you got back on your feet, not permanently, not as a retirement plan. My mother's eyes filled with tears. The waterworks that had been her go-to manipulation tactic since I was old enough to feel guilty about making her cry. "We're your parents, Valentina. We sacrificed everything for you. This is how you repay us?" The word sacrificed hit me like a physical blow. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd actually witnessed during my childhood. My mother giving up her weekly manicures for exactly 1 month when money was tight, then finding creative ways to justify the expense again. My father selling his boat, only to buy a more expensive one 6 months later. The countless times they'd chosen their own comfort over mine, their own desires over my needs. "What exactly did you sacrifice?" I asked, genuinely curious, because I remember a childhood where you prioritized your country club membership over my orthodontic treatment, where you spent money on a kitchen renovation instead of fixing the leak in my bedroom ceiling that dripped for 3 years, where you took annual trips to Europe while telling me we couldn't afford summer camp? You're remembering it wrong, my mother said quickly, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. We did the best we could with what we had. With what you had. I stood up from the table, needing the physical movement to process the emotions churning through me. You had plenty of money. You just chose to spend it on yourselves instead of investing in your daughter's future. I walked to the built-in china cabinet where I kept important documents, pulling out a folder I'd hoped I'd never need to show them. Inside were bank statements, mortgage documents, utility bills, and property tax records dating back 4 years. Since we're talking about money and responsibility, I said, returning to the table and spreading the documents across the surface, let me show you exactly who's been living off whose money. My father picked up one of the bank statements, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. I watched his face change as he processed the numbers, the reality of my financial situation becoming clear to him for perhaps the first time. "This is your account?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "My account, my mortgage, my property taxes, my utility bills," I confirmed. "Everything you see here has been paid from my salary at Meridian Financial Group, the job you just accused me of lying about losing." My mother was staring at a utility bill for $347, her face growing paler by the second. "But we thought, we assumed—" "You assumed what?" I asked, settling back into my chair. "That, because I'm your daughter, I must be financially irresponsible. That because I'm young, I must be living beyond my means. That because I'm single, I must need your guidance and support." The truth was becoming visible on their faces, like developing photographs. The gradual recognition of how wrong they'd been about my life, my capabilities, my independence. For 8 months, they'd been living in my house, eating my food, using my utilities, enjoying my hospitality, all while maintaining the fiction that they were the responsible adults who were somehow supporting their wayward daughter. "But if you're doing so well financially," my father said slowly, "why did you joke about being fired? Why would you scare us like that?" The question revealed so much about their mindset that I almost felt sorry for them. They'd been living in my house for 8 months, but they'd never once asked about my job, my career, my professional achievements or challenges. They'd never shown interest in what I did for a living beyond the vague knowledge that I worked in finance. They'd never asked about my goals, my ambitions, or my plans for the future. I joked about being fired because I thought my parents might be happy to hear about my promotion, I said, hearing the sadness in my own voice. "I thought maybe for once you might congratulate me on my success instead of finding ways to minimize it or turn it into something negative." My mother was crying now, but they weren't the manipulative tears I'd grown up seeing. These looked genuine, born of recognition and regret rather than tactical emotional manipulation. "We didn't know," she whispered. "We really didn't know how well you were doing." "How could you not know?" I asked, and I realized that this was the heart of our problem. "You've been living in my house for 8 months. You see me leave for work every morning in professional clothes, driving my late model car. You've been eating meals I prepare with ingredients I purchase. You've been sleeping in guest rooms I furnished, using towels I bought, watching television on services I pay for. How could you not know? The answer, I was beginning to understand, was that they'd never really seen me at all. In their minds, I was still the 18-year-old girl who'd left for college, dependent on their wisdom and guidance, incapable of managing my own life successfully. They'd frozen me in time, preserving a version of our relationship that had never really existed even when I was younger. We just assumed, my father said weakly, that you were struggling like everyone else. Young people today, the economy, the job market. Dad, I'm 32 years old, I said. I've been working in my field for over a decade. I own a house worth $750,000. I have a six-figure salary and a retirement account that's on track for early financial independence. At what point do I stop being a young person who needs your assumptions about my incompetence? The mortgage document in front of my mother caught her attention, and she studied it with the kind of focus she usually reserved for sale catalogs. This says you put down 20% when you bought the house, she said, her voice filled with something that might have been respect. $150,000, I confirmed, saved over 6 years while I was building my career and establishing my credit. But where did you get that kind of money? My father asked, and I could see him trying to reconcile this new information with his long-held beliefs about my financial irresponsibility. From working, I said simply, from living below my means, from making smart investment choices, from prioritizing long-term financial stability over immediate gratification. The same principles you always claimed to believe in, but never actually demonstrated. My mother set down the mortgage document and looked around the dining room as if seeing it for the first time. "This is all yours," she said, not really asking, but confirming a reality she was finally accepting. The house, the furniture, the car in the driveway, the food in the refrigerator, I said. All of it purchased with money I earned at the job you just accused me of lying about. The weight of their misunderstanding was settling over the room like a heavy blanket. For 8 months, they'd been living as guests in their daughter's home while believing themselves to be the responsible adults supporting their irresponsible child. The cognitive dissonance was so profound that I could see them struggling to process it. "But if you don't need our help," my mother said slowly, "why did you let us move in?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself with increasing frequency over the past few months. Why had I allowed them to stay when it became clear that their temporary situation was becoming permanent? Why had I continued to subsidize their lifestyle when they showed no signs of contributing or even acknowledging my generosity? "Because you're my parents," I said, the simple truth that had guided my decision-making since that February morning. Because when you showed up at my door saying you needed help, I wanted to help you. Because despite everything, I love you, and I thought this might be a chance for us to build a better relationship." "Despite everything?" my father repeated, his voice sharp with wounded pride. I nodded, thinking about the years of emotional distance, the constant criticism disguised as concern, the way they'd always seemed to view my successes as somehow threatening or undeserving. "Despite the fact that you've never really approved of my choices or celebrated my achievements. Despite the fact that you've consistently underestimated my capabilities and overestimated my need for your guidance." "That's not fair," my mother protested, but her heart didn't seem to be in the denial. "Isn't it?" I asked. When I graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern, you told me not to get too big for my britches. When I got my first promotion at Meridian, you warned me about tall poppy syndrome. When I bought this house, you suggested I was being financially reckless. When have you ever just been proud of me without adding a qualification or a concern? The silence that followed was different from the angry quiet that had preceded our confrontation. This was the silence of recognition, of parents beginning to understand how their well-intentioned criticism had been received by their daughter over the years. "We were trying to protect you," my father said finally, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "We didn't want you to get hurt by being too confident or taking too many risks." "Protect me from what?" I asked. "From success? From independence? From believing in myself?" My mother was staring at her hands, her wedding ring catching the light as she twisted it around her finger. "We grew up differently," she said quietly. "In our generation, women didn't. It wasn't the same." I understood what she was trying to say, the generational gap that had shaped their expectations and fears. They'd grown up in a world where financial independence for women was rare, where success could be threatening to traditional gender roles, where a daughter's achievements might be viewed with suspicion rather than pride. "But that doesn't explain why you moved into my house and then spent 8 months criticizing my lifestyle while contributing nothing to it," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle despite the frustration I was feeling. "We didn't criticize," my father said automatically, then stopped himself. "Did we?" I thought about the daily comments about my spending habits, the suggestions that I was too focused on work, the implications that my single status was somehow a personal failing that reflected poorly on their parenting, the constant stream of helpful advice about how I should live my life, manage my money, prioritize my relationships. "You've been living in my house for 8 months," I said, "and in that time, you've criticized my furniture choices, my food preferences, my work schedule, my social life, my car, my clothes, and my decision to remain single after my divorce. The only thing you haven't criticized is the fact that I've been supporting you financially, and that's only because you didn't realize I was doing it." The truth of this statement seemed to hit them like cold water. My father's face went through a series of expressions, from denial to recognition to what might have been shame. My mother had gone very still, as if she were reviewing the past 8 months through this new lens of understanding. "Oh my God," she whispered, "we've been terrible guests." "You've been worse than guests," I said, feeling the words emerge from some deep place of honesty I'd been avoiding for months. Guests say thank you. Guests offer to contribute. Guests recognize that they're receiving hospitality and express gratitude for it. My father was staring at the financial documents spread across the table, and I could see him calculating numbers in his head. "How much have we cost you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I'd actually run those numbers several months ago when I'd started to wonder about the long-term sustainability of our arrangement, including the increase in utilities, groceries, household supplies, and the opportunity cost of having my guest rooms occupied permanently. I paused, letting him prepare for the answer. "About $4,000 per month." The number hung in the air between us like an accusation. $4,000 per month for 8 months meant I'd been subsidizing their lifestyle to the tune of $32,000, more than half of many people's annual salaries. contributed silently and without acknowledgement while they criticized my supposed financial irresponsibility. $32,000, my mother said, her voice filled with horror. We've cost you $32,000. And counting, I added, though I took no pleasure in their distress, because despite what you said tonight about being tired of supporting me, the truth is that I've been supporting you completely. While you've been treating me like an irresponsible child who needs your guidance and criticism. My father pushed back from the table and stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the garden I'd planted and maintained since buying the house. We need to pay you back, he said, his shoulders slumped with what I recognized as defeat. With what money? I asked, not unkindly, but realistically. You moved in here because you couldn't afford your previous housing situation. Unless something has changed dramatically in the past 8 months, I don't think you're in a position to repay $32,000. This was the crux of our problem, and we all knew it. They'd been living beyond their means for years, using credit cards and loans to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. Their retirement had been forced on them when their financial house of cards had finally collapsed, and moving in with me had been their solution to avoid the consequences of their poor financial planning. We could sell some things, my mother suggested weakly. The jewelry, maybe some of the furniture we have in storage. I thought about the storage unit they'd been renting for 8 months at $150 per month, another expense they'd somehow found money for, while claiming they couldn't contribute to household costs. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were paying to store furniture while living rent-free in my fully furnished home. Mom, we both know that your jewelry and furniture aren't worth $32,000, I said gently, and even if they were, selling everything you own to repay your daughter for housing costs isn't really a sustainable solution to your financial problems. The three of us sat in the uncomfortable silence of people who had finally arrived at the truth of their situation. My parents were broke. I had been subsidizing their lifestyle for months, and they had somehow convinced themselves that I was the one living irresponsibly off their money. What do we do now? My father asked, turning from the window to face me. For the first time in my adult life, he was asking for my guidance rather than offering his own unwanted advice. It was a good question, and one I'd been considering for weeks as our living arrangement had become increasingly untenable. I couldn't continue supporting them indefinitely, both financially and emotionally, but I also couldn't simply throw my parents out onto the street, regardless of how ungrateful and critical they'd been. First, I said, we need to be honest about what this situation really is. You're not helping me or supporting me. I'm helping you. I'm providing you with housing, food, utilities, and household necessities because you can't afford to provide them for yourselves. My mother nodded reluctantly, tears still streaming down her face. We know that now. Second, I continued, if you're going to continue living here, there need to be some changes. No more criticism of my choices, my lifestyle, or my decisions. This is my house, and I'm not going to be made to feel unwelcome in my own home. Of course, my father said quickly. We're sorry. We didn't realize. Third, I said, we need to talk about the future. This can't be a permanent arrangement. You need to develop a plan for independent housing, whether that means finding jobs, applying for assistance, or making some other kind of living arrangement. The word jobs seemed to startle them, as if the possibility of returning to work hadn't occurred to them. They'd been in retirement mode for so long that they'd forgotten they were only 64 and 62 years old, respectively. Certainly young enough to work if they were willing to swallow their pride and accept employment that might be less prestigious than their previous careers. "We're too old to start over," my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're younger than many people who are just hitting their career stride," I replied, "and you have skills, experience, and education that employers value. The question is whether you're willing to work or whether you'd rather continue living as dependents." The word dependents clearly stung, but it was accurate. For 8 months, they'd been my dependents, relying on my income to support their lifestyle while contributing nothing meaningful to the household or the relationship. "How long do we have?" my father asked, and I could see him trying to calculate timelines and possibilities in his head. "That depends on how quickly you can develop and implement a plan," I said. "I'm not giving you an eviction notice, but I'm also not committing to supporting you indefinitely. If you're serious about changing this situation, I'm willing to help you figure out realistic next steps." My mother looked around the dining room again, her gaze lingering on the elegant details I'd chosen when decorating the space. "We never realized how beautiful you'd made this place," she said softly. "We never really looked at what you'd accomplished." It was a small acknowledgement, but it meant more to me than she probably realized. For years, I'd been seeking their approval, their recognition, their simple acknowledgement that I was a capable adult who had built a good life for herself. To hear my mother finally see my achievements, even in this moment of crisis and revelation, felt like a tiny victory. "I've worked hard to build the life I wanted," I said simply. "I'm proud of what I've accomplished, even if it took me a while to stop needing your approval to feel good about it." "You should be proud," my father said, his voice filled with something I'd rarely heard from him: genuine respect. "We raised a daughter who's more successful than we ever were, and instead of celebrating that, we've been—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but I knew what he was trying to say. They'd been threatened by my success, intimidated by my independence, confused by my ability to thrive without their guidance or support. "You raised a daughter who learned to be self-reliant," I said, offering him a way to reframe their parenting that was less damaging to his self-image. "Maybe not in the way you intended, but that's not necessarily a bad thing." The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about timelines and expectations, emotional territory about our relationship dynamics, and financial realities about what they could and couldn't afford. By the time we cleared the dinner dishes, we'd established a tentative framework for moving forward that acknowledged the truth of our situation rather than the fiction we'd all been maintaining. As I loaded the dishwasher, I reflected on how dramatically the evening had shifted from my simple joke about being fired to this fundamental reordering of our family dynamics. In the span of 3 hours, we dismantled years of assumptions, misconceptions, and destructive patterns. But even as we'd made progress toward honesty and mutual respect, I knew that the real work was just beginning. Changing lifelong patterns of behavior and communication would require sustained effort from all of us. And I still hadn't told them the most important thing of all, the news that would change everything they thought they knew about my financial situation and my ability to support them going forward. The promotion Patricia had offered me that afternoon came with more than just a 40% salary increase and a corner office. It also came with a relocation requirement that would take me 3,000 miles away from Seattle to the company's expanding East Coast operations in Manhattan. I had 60 days to decide whether to accept the position, 60 days to determine whether this opportunity was worth leaving behind the life I'd built in Washington. Looking at my parents as they dried dishes in my kitchen, finally understanding the reality of our situation, I realized that my decision would affect more than just my own future. If I took the promotion, they would need to find alternative housing much sooner than any of us had anticipated. If I stayed in Seattle, I would be choosing to prioritize their stability over my own career advancement. The irony wasn't lost on me that after years of their criticism and lack of support, I was now in a position where their financial security depended entirely on my career decisions. The daughter they'd accused of living irresponsibly off their money was actually the only thing standing between them and genuine financial catastrophe. As we finished cleaning up from dinner, my father approached me with a humility I'd never seen from him before. "Valentina," he said, "I want you to know that we're grateful for everything you've done for us. I'm sorry it took us so long to realize what was really happening here." I nodded, accepting his apology while recognizing that gratitude and changed behavior were two different things. "Thank you for saying that, Dad. It means a lot to hear you acknowledge what I've been contributing." "More than contributing," my mother added, hanging up the dish towel with careful precision. "You've been taking care of us, and we've been behaving like ungrateful children." The acknowledgement was satisfying, but it also highlighted how much our relationship dynamic would need to change for us to coexist successfully, whether in the same house or at a distance. They would need to learn to see me as an adult whose decisions deserved respect, and I would need to learn to set boundaries that protected my own well-being while still honoring my love for them. "We'll figure this out," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what this would ultimately look like. We're family, and family finds a way to work things out. But even as I said the words, I could feel the weight of the decision I hadn't yet shared with them. In my briefcase upstairs was an offer letter that could change all our lives, an opportunity that would force all of us to confront what family really meant when financial dependence and geographic distance were added to the equation. The evening had revealed the truth about our current situation, but the real test of our new understanding was still to come. In the quiet hours after our confrontation, as my parents retreated to their guest rooms and I sat alone in my living room, I pulled out my phone and stared at Patricia's contact information. I had promised to give her an answer about the Manhattan position within the week, but now that decision carried implications far beyond my own career trajectory. For the first time in 8 months, my parents understood who was really supporting whom in our household. But they had no idea that their newfound gratitude and respect might be coming just as I was preparing to leave them behind entirely. The question was whether I was strong enough to prioritize my own future over their immediate needs, and whether they were capable of building their own financial independence without relying on their daughter's continued sacrifice. The answer to both questions would determine not just where I lived and worked, but who we all became in the process of untangling our complicated family bonds. As I sat in the house I'd built with my own hands and my own money, surrounded by the evidence of my independent success, I realized that the most difficult conversation was still ahead of us. Tomorrow, I would need to tell them about Manhattan. The morning came with Seattle's typical November drizzle, the kind of persistent mist that made everything feel muted and contemplative. I woke at 5:30 as usual, padding downstairs to make coffee in the kitchen that had become the epicenter of our family's financial reckoning the night before. The documents we'd spread across the dining table were still there, a paper trail of truth that seemed to glow in the early morning light filtering through the windows. My parents were still asleep, probably exhausted from the emotional upheaval of finally seeing our situation clearly. I stood at the kitchen window, watching raindrops trace lazy paths down the glass, and tried to imagine having this same view from a Manhattan apartment 30 floors above the street. The contrast was so stark, it felt like comparing two different lives entirely. By 7 o'clock, I could hear movement upstairs, the familiar sounds of my parents beginning their day in what they now understood was my house, not theirs. When my mother appeared in the kitchen 20 minutes later, she looked smaller somehow, as if the realization of our true circumstances had physically diminished her overnight. "Good morning," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of yesterday's imperious confidence. "Thank you for the coffee." I nodded, noting how different this simple expression of gratitude felt from her usual assumption that coffee would simply appear. "How did you sleep?" "Not well," she admitted, settling into the breakfast nook that overlooked my carefully tended garden. "I kept thinking about what you said, about how we've been treating you." My father joined us a few minutes later, his hair uncombed and his reading glasses askew. He looked older than his 64 years, burdened by the weight of yesterday's revelations. Without his usual morning bluster, he seemed almost fragile. "Valentina," he said, pouring himself coffee with hands that trembled slightly, "your mother and I talked last night. We want to make this right." I waited for him to continue, recognizing the importance of letting him find his own words rather than rushing to fill the silence. "We're going to start looking for jobs today," he said, the words clearly difficult for him to voice. "Both of us. We can't continue living here without contributing something." The declaration surprised me with its swiftness. I'd expected weeks of negotiation and gradual acceptance, not this immediate pivot toward responsibility. "What kind of work are you thinking about?" My mother twisted her wedding ring, a gesture I now recognized as her response to uncomfortable topics. I was a school administrator for 30 years before I retired. Maybe I could substitute teach or work in an office part-time, something to bring in some income. "And I still have my engineering license," my father added, though his voice lacked conviction. "There might be consulting opportunities, project work, something that doesn't require full-time commitment but pays decent money." I listened to their tentative plans, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride that they were finally taking responsibility for their situation, sadness that it had taken such a dramatic confrontation to motivate them toward independence. "Those sound like good starting points," I said diplomatically, "but I need to tell you something that might affect your timeline." They both looked at me with expressions of apprehension, as if they'd used up their quota of life-changing revelations and weren't ready for another one. The promotion I mentioned yesterday, I began, choosing my words carefully, it comes with a relocation requirement. The company wants me to move to Manhattan to head up their East Coast operations. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the rain intensifying against the windows. My mother's coffee mug paused halfway to her lips, and my father went very still in a way that reminded me of animals sensing danger. Manhattan? My mother repeated slowly, as if the word were foreign, as in New York City, as in 3,000 miles away. I confirmed. I have 60 days to decide whether to accept the position. My father set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. And if you accept it, then I'll be selling this house and moving across the country for the biggest career opportunity I've ever been offered. I paused, letting the implications settle, which means you'll need to find alternative housing arrangements much sooner than we discussed last night. The weight of this new information transformed the atmosphere in the kitchen from cautious optimism to something approaching panic. I could see them recalculating timelines, reassessing possibilities, confronting the reality that their daughter's success might ultimately leave them behind. How big an opportunity? My mother asked, her school administrator instincts focusing on practical details. Vice President of Portfolio Management for their entire East Coast division, I said, unable to keep the pride from my voice despite the gravity of our conversation. It would essentially make me the youngest VP in the company's history. That's incredible, sweetheart, my father said, and for once his praise came without qualifications or concerns. That's the kind of position people spend their entire careers working toward. The genuine happiness in his voice caught me off guard. After years of his diminishing my achievements, hearing him celebrate my success felt like receiving an unexpected gift. It is incredible, I agreed. It's also terrifying and complicated and would require me to leave behind everything I've built here. Including us, my mother said quietly, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Including you, I confirmed, at least physically, though given our track record with communication, it's possible that distance might actually improve our relationship. The attempt at levity fell flat, highlighting the seriousness of what we were contemplating. After decades of complicated family dynamics, we'd finally found our way to honesty and mutual respect, only to discover that my career success might immediately separate us again. When do you have to decide? My father asked, his engineering mind already working through logistics and timelines. By next Friday, I said. Patricia needs an answer so she can begin the transition process if I'm going. That's 8 days, my mother calculated aloud. 8 days to figure out the rest of our lives? I nodded, feeling the pressure of the decision settling over all of us like a heavy blanket. I've been going back and forth about it for weeks. The career opportunity is enormous, but leaving Seattle means leaving my life here. Have you thought about what you want to do? My father asked, and I realized he was asking about my desires rather than telling me what he thought I should do. The shift in his approach was subtle but significant. I go back and forth, I admitted. Some days, I think I'd be crazy not to take it. Other days, I think I'd be crazy to leave behind everything I've worked to build here. We sat in contemplative silence, each of us processing the magnitude of the decision and its implications for our family's future. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the roof of the house that might soon be sold to facilitate my move across the country. "Can I ask you something?" my mother said eventually, her voice tentative. "Do you think you've been staying in Seattle partly because of us? Because you felt responsible for taking care of us?" The question was so perceptive, it took my breath away. Had I been unconsciously limiting my career options out of some sense of obligation to parents who'd never asked for my help and hadn't even acknowledged receiving it? "Maybe," I said honestly. "I've been worried about what would happen to you if I wasn't here to provide stability." "But we're not your responsibility," my father said firmly. "We're adults who should be taking care of ourselves, not expecting our daughter to sacrifice her career for our poor planning." The clarity of his statement surprised me almost as much as his earlier praise had. This was the father I'd always wanted, the one who prioritized my success over his own comfort, who saw my achievements as worthy of celebration rather than concern. "I know that intellectually," I said, "but emotionally, it's harder to separate my sense of duty from my career decisions." "Then let us make it easier for you," my mother said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "We're going to figure out our own situation with or without your help. We should have been doing that all along." The gesture was so unexpected that I felt tears prick my eyes. When was the last time my mother had initiated physical contact that was about comfort rather than manipulation? "You don't have to make that decision right now," I said, though I appreciated her intention. "We still have time to explore options." "No," my father said, his voice carrying the authority I remembered from my childhood. "We've made enough decisions that have limited your life. This one is yours to make without worrying about us." The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about housing options for them and career considerations for me. By the time they left to begin their job search, we'd established a framework for moving forward that acknowledged both my opportunity and their responsibility for their own future. But even as they drove away in my father's aging sedan, I found myself wondering whether their newfound independence was genuine or simply a response to the crisis of potentially losing their safety net. Would they follow through on their promises of self-sufficiency? Or would they find new ways to make their problems my responsibility? The answer came sooner than I expected. By Wednesday, my mother had secured 2 interviews for part-time administrative positions, and my father had contacted 3 former colleagues about consulting opportunities. By Friday, she'd been offered a job as a receptionist at a pediatric clinic, and he'd landed a 6-month contract to review environmental compliance for a construction firm. "It's not glamorous work," my mother said over dinner that evening, "but it's honest work, and it pays enough to cover basic expenses. And my contract pays well enough that we could afford a small apartment," my father added, consulting notes he'd made about rental properties in less expensive neighborhoods. Not luxury, but decent and clean. I listened to their plans with a mixture of pride and skepticism. After months of living in my house without contributing anything, they'd managed to secure employment and housing in less than a week. The speed of their transformation was either inspiring or suspicious, depending on how I chose to interpret it. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it. even as I wondered what had taken them so long to pursue these options. "When would you start working?" "Monday," they said in unison, then looked at each other and laughed. The sound was so unexpected and genuine that I felt some of my skepticism melting away. "And we found an apartment we can afford," my mother continued, pulling out printouts from rental websites. "It's smaller than what we're used to, but it's in a nice neighborhood with good public transportation." I examined the listings they'd found, modest one-bedroom apartments in areas of the city I rarely visited. The rent was less than half what I'd been spending to support them, a reminder of how much their presence had been costing me financially. "When could you move in?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the relief I was feeling. "First of the month," my father said, "which gives us 2 weeks to save up for deposits and get organized." 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, I would have my house back, my privacy restored, my financial burden lifted. The timing was almost too convenient, as if the universe were clearing obstacles from my path toward the Manhattan opportunity. "Have you made your decision?" my mother asked, gesturing toward the folder where I kept Patricia's offer letter. "About New York?" I looked at the folder, then at my parents, who were watching me with expressions of genuine interest rather than the anxiety I'd expected. "I think I have," I said slowly, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "And?" my father prompted gently. "I'm going to take it," I said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating as they left my mouth. "I'm going to move to Manhattan and take the position." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet of our dinner confrontation earlier in the week. This was contemplative, supportive, tinged with sadness, but not opposition. "I'm proud of you," my mother said finally, tears gathering in her eyes. "It takes courage to choose the unknown over the comfortable." "And we're going to be fine," my father added, reaching across the table to squeeze my shoulder. "You've given us a gift by forcing us to become independent again. We'd forgotten what we were capable of." The conversation that evening was unlike any we'd had in my adult life. Instead of criticism and concern, they offered encouragement and support. Instead of warnings about risks and consequences, they celebrated my ambition and potential. For the first time, I felt like they saw me as a capable adult whose decisions deserved respect rather than commentary. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. I called Patricia on Monday morning to accept the position, setting in motion a complex series of arrangements for my relocation and transition. My parents threw themselves into their new jobs with an enthusiasm that surprised all of us, coming home each evening with stories about colleagues and customers and the satisfaction of earning their own money again. The house, meanwhile, began to feel different as we all prepared for our separate futures. I started the process of finding a realtor and determining market value, while my parents packed their belongings and made arrangements for their new apartment. The space that had felt crowded and tense for months gradually opened up, becoming lighter and more peaceful as we each claimed our independence. On the Saturday before they were scheduled to move out, my father approached me while I was sorting through my own belongings in preparation for the cross-country move. "I need to apologize to you," he said, settling into the chair by my bedroom window, "not just for the past 8 months, but for years of not seeing you clearly." I looked up from the box of books I was packing, surprised by the gravity in his voice. "Dad, we've been through this. You don't need to keep apologizing. Yes, I do, he said firmly, because I realized something this week that I should have understood years ago. He paused, gathering his thoughts, and I could see him struggling with emotions he'd rarely expressed. You're not just successful despite our parenting, he continued. You're successful because of who you are as a person, your integrity, your work ethic, your independence, your kindness, even when we didn't deserve it. Those qualities came from you, not from us. The acknowledgement hit me harder than I'd expected. For years, I'd been seeking their approval and recognition, wanting them to see my achievements as worthy of pride. But what I'd really been craving was their understanding of who I was as a person, not just what I'd accomplished professionally. Thank you for saying that, I said, my voice thick with emotion. It means more than you know. Your mother and I talked about this, he said. We've been so focused on protecting you from failure that we never celebrated your successes. We've been so worried about you becoming too confident that we never acknowledged how much confidence you'd earned. I sat on the edge of my bed, looking at this man who'd raised me with the best intentions, but the wrong approach. I know you meant well. I've always known that. Meaning well isn't enough, he said. You deserved parents who cheered for your victories instead of warning you about defeat. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering decades of missed opportunities for connection and understanding. By the time he left my room, we'd established a foundation for a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than parental authority and filial obligation. Sunday morning brought moving trucks and the organized chaos of my parents' departure from my house. I helped them load furniture and boxes, marveling at how much they'd accumulated during their 8 months as my uninvited guests. The process was surprisingly emotional, marking the end of an arrangement that had been difficult but had ultimately led to important revelations about our family dynamics. This isn't goodbye, my mother said as they prepared to drive away to their new apartment. We'll see each other before you leave for New York. And after I get there, I assured her, meaning it more than I'd expected to. Distance doesn't have to mean disconnection. No, my father agreed, it doesn't. And maybe some distance will help us appreciate each other better. After they left, I walked through my house alone for the first time in 8 months. The silence was profound, but it wasn't lonely. It was peaceful, spacious, full of possibility. I could breathe deeply without worrying about criticism or judgment. I could make decisions without consultation or justification. The realtor I'd contacted had scheduled a market analysis for Tuesday, and I'd already begun researching Manhattan neighborhoods and apartment options. The logistics of relocating across the country were daunting, but they were also exciting in a way I hadn't anticipated. That evening, I called Patricia to discuss details about my start date and the transition process. I have to say, she told me, you sound different. More decisive, more confident. I feel different, I admitted. The past few weeks have clarified a lot of things for me. Family situations have a way of doing that, she said knowingly. Sometimes the biggest obstacles to our growth come from the people who love us most. The observation was more accurate than she probably realized. My parents' well-intentioned but misguided concern had been limiting my potential for years, not because they wanted to hold me back, but because they'd never learned to trust my judgment or celebrate my independence. Over the next month, as I prepared for my move to Manhattan, I maintained regular contact with my parents without the underlying tension that had characterized our relationship for so long. They were thriving in their new jobs and apartment, rediscovering capabilities they'd forgotten they possessed. I was thriving in the anticipation of my new role, finally free to pursue opportunities without the weight of family obligation holding me back. The house sold quickly for above asking price, validating my investment decisions and providing the capital I needed for my New York transition. My parents' financial independence meant I could use the proceeds for my own future rather than continuing to subsidize their lifestyle. On my last night in Seattle, I stood in my empty house, remembering the evening 3 weeks earlier when a simple dinner joke had triggered the confrontation that changed everything. The dining room where we'd spread financial documents across the mahogany table was bare now, ready for its new owners to fill with their own furniture and memories. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother, "Thinking of you tonight. So proud of everything you've accomplished and everything you're about to accomplish. Love you." The message was followed by one from my father. "Your grandmother would be proud of the woman you've become." We certainly are. Safe travels tomorrow. Standing in that empty house, surrounded by boxes ready for the moving truck, I felt something I'd been seeking my entire adult life: my parents' unconditional approval and support. It had taken a crisis and painful honesty to get there, but we'd finally found our way to a relationship based on respect rather than criticism, encouragement rather than concern. The flight to Manhattan the next morning marked more than just a change of geography. It represented the beginning of a life where my choices were truly my own, where my success would be celebrated rather than qualified, where my independence would be seen as strength rather than stubbornness. As the plane lifted off from Seattle, I looked down at the city where I'd built my career and my character, where I'd learned to stand up for myself and demand the respect I deserved. The view from 30,000 feet put everything in perspective: the house I'd sold, the family dynamics I'd confronted, the courage I'd found to choose my future over my comfort. 6 months later, I was settled in my Manhattan office, leading a team of analysts and managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. My parents visited for a weekend in spring, marveling at my apartment and my achievements with the kind of unconditional pride I'd always wanted from them. "We never imagined you'd accomplish something this significant," my mother said as we had dinner at a restaurant near my office building. "I did," I replied, smiling at the irony. "I always knew I was capable of more than you gave me credit for." "Yes," my father said, raising his wine glass in a toast, "you did, and you were right." The acknowledgement was sweet, but it was no longer necessary for my sense of self-worth. I'd learned to believe in my own capabilities, regardless of external validation, to pursue my goals whether or not others understood them, to build the life I wanted rather than the life others expected. The confrontation that had begun with a joke about being fired had ended with the truth about who was really supporting whom in our family. But more importantly, it had led to genuine understanding, mutual respect, and the kind of honest relationship I'd always hoped we could have. Sometimes the worst moments reveal the most important truths. Sometimes the people who seem to be holding us back are actually teaching us to stand up for ourselves. And sometimes a simple dinner conversation can change the entire trajectory of your life if you're brave enough to speak the truth when it matters most. My parents learned they were stronger and more capable than they'd remembered. I learned I was worth more respect than I'd been accepting. And together, we learned that family love doesn't require sacrifice of individual dreams, but rather the courage to support each other's growth, even when that growth leads in unexpected directions. The house I'd defended was gone now, sold to fund my future. But what I'd really been defending that night wasn't property or money. It was my right to be seen clearly, valued appropriately, and supported genuinely by the people who claimed to love me most. That victory had made all the others possible.